مؤسسة خالد شومان. أحد أكثر أدوات الرأسمالية فعالية للحفاظ على هيمنتها على العالم هي قدرتها على استهلاك الثورات الاجتماعية والفنية وتغييرها لخلقها على صورتها. سيناقش هيثم النصر في هذه المحاضرة الطرق التي توظف فيها أعمال الخيال العلمي والفولكلور واللعب والوسائط الرقمية التفاعلية كأدوات لتخيل عالم لتجاوز الرأسمالية والاستعمار والنظام الأبوي المغاير وأنظمة القمع الأخرى التي تقدم نفسها كجزء من العالم الطبيعي. رأسمالية أعيدت صياغتها وأعيد تشكيلها في هيئة الثورة. تلي المحاضرة مع هيثم بتقديم هيثم، مناقشة مع كريم اسطفان ومشاركين بأكاديمية دارة الفنون الصيفية باللغة الإنجليزية. هيثم النصر أقدم لكم إياه فنان ومصمم تفاعل. يمكن النظر إلى الكثير من أعمال هيثم من خلال لغة الخيال العلمي والفولكلور والعمل والطوبويات الثورية المتقاطعة. تشمل أعمال الرسومات واللوحات والنحت وألعاب الفيديو والنصوص والأداء، وقد عرضت في آلت سبيس لوب في سيول ومتحف سورسو في بيروت ومتحف الصورة المتحركة بنيويورك والجامعة العربية الأمريكية بجنين. وكريم اسطفان مدير الحوار هو كاتب ومحرر وناقد فني ومدرس وزميل دارة الفنون لعام 2021 وطالب دكتوراه في الثقافة الحديثة والإعلام في جامعة براون. الحوار سيعقد باللغة الإنجليزية ويلي الحوار برضو جلسة Q&A مناقشة. فشكرا كريم وشكرا هيثم. حاطي لكريم يقدم.
شكرا يزن. هحكي بالإنجليزي مثل ما قال يزن. Thank you all for being here for the latest event in the World Building in the Wake program series. Now, after Darat al-Funun's soft reopening, I wish I were in Amman to see Haithem's work in person. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to, and if not, he'll be presenting both the ideas and the images emerging from his practice. So this is the fourth event in the series, and I should mention that all previous ones are available on Darat's site and on its YouTube. World Building in the Wake features artists and thinkers who are reorienting the imagination to the poetics and politics of world building in the wake of catastrophe, so that visions of the yet to come are always also returns to the practices, epistemologies, and dreams of those whose worlds were expropriated or destroyed. So for those most vulnerable to the slow violence of extractive capitalism and settler colonialism, we know the end of the world is nothing new. To paraphrase the late scholar Patrick Wolf, apocalypse is a structure, not an event. The catastrophe is ongoing. Or as June Tyson sings in Sun Ra's Space is the Place, it's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? And Haitham is a brilliant artist speaking to the many ends of worlds and what comes after and how we build from within. So I'm glad to have him here today. He is going to present first, followed by a conversation between him and me and the participants of Darat's Summer Academy, and then a general Q&A for all of you present. So I hope to have your participation later in the program. You're welcome to ask questions, of course, in Arabic or in English. Haitham is comfortable, fielding questions however you want to give them. Yeah, without further ado, welcome Haitham.
شكرا كريم، شكرا يزن، وشكرا لدارة الفنون. زي ما يزن وكريم حكوا قبل شوي، المحاضرة حتكون باللغة الإنجليزية، بس في حال في أي أسئلة باللغة سواء كان بالإنجليزي أو بالعربي بعد المحاضرة رح أكون متحمس إنه نبلش هذا الحوار. Thank you all for joining this talk and attending. I'm very excited to be here with Darat al-Funun and to be part of this series. Let me share my screen real quickly and talk a little bit about what I have in store for you all today. Let's start the presentation. And so before we start talking, I think a couple of things that I want to mention. This presentation is related to the work that I'm currently showing at Darat al-Funun, which is a series of digital works, including a 3-part interactive project that was published by Lebnاء, which is a multidisciplinary publishing platform that focuses on alternative forms of publishing and supporting artists in different media and mediums. And these works that are currently exhibited at Darat al-Funun are available through Lebnاء's website and through my website for those of us who cannot attend the exhibition in Amman. The talk today is titled, It is Possible for Humankind to be as Seductive as Capitalism Itself. And it is basically a sentence that emerged in one of my pieces and that I have developed further into a talk today to discuss some thoughts and notes I have about my practice in general, which includes the work that is being exhibited at Darat al-Funun. And throughout, there will be images and stills from different works of mine throughout the process. So it is the talk is divided into 3 different sections. The first is talks about the revolution, and I think before we start talking about the revolution, I think we can start talking about capitalism. And capitalism is like an onion, each layer being a different system of oppression. I think that was a turning point for both me and my practice, was to understand that the different systems of oppression that we live through and experience today are either directly related or a product of capitalism, whether it's colonialism being linked to capitalism, racism being linked to colonialism and capitalism, heteropatriarchy and the climate apocalypse that we are currently living in and that is unfolding. And as a side note, this is not a diss to onions. I love onions, and so my way of remedying that comparison is by structuring this talk like an onion and kind of slowly building up the layers of my argument and my practice as we go. And one good starting point is to realize that capitalism, although capitalism presents itself as part of the natural world, as something that has always existed there, it's important to understand that that's not the case. It did not always exist since the dawn of time, and it's not a part of the natural world, even though it is the most dominant force of the world right now. And it's important to also realize that capitalism is not inherently seductive itself. We do not automatically love capitalism. We're not automatically drawn to it. We are conditioned at very young ages to appreciate it and to be indoctrinated into it. However, it is something that is forced on us. And so it is not inevitable, therefore, that capitalism will continue its current trajectory of destroying our planet and ensuring the extinction of our species. A world beyond capitalism is possible. So this is kind of like the very basic foundation for what I think should be any artwork, but definitely for my particular practice. And from that, we can move into figuring out what to do about it. And so going back to the idea of a revolution, revolutionary work is the process of dismantling those many systems of oppression that stem from capitalism that we experience today, be it colonialism or any of the other systems of oppression. Which brings us to cultural production and how art can be part of that revolutionary work of dismantling capitalism and these different systems of oppression. And I think one thing that I was taught and I was led to believe and I realized was a complete fallacy is that art is a form of, is that art is often dismissed as a form of self-expression. And however, it's important for us to realize that art is not just self-expression, art is labor. And artists are workers. Culture is produced through the labor of artists. And so I think for us as artists, it's important for us to realize that what we do is labor and that what we produce is culture. And this is important because then you start to realize that, like a lot of other workers, artists are kept in a cycle of hyper competition for resources and survival because of the power that our labor holds. And this is twofold. I think that anyone who is a young and coming artist and an emerging artist between quotes is dealing with the brutality of a very precarious lifestyle in which there are really not many structures that support your practice, that can put food on the table. There's always an amount of competition with other artists and trying to step on other artists in order to get what little resources you have for the vast majority. And then you have a few superstars who are part of that system who are comfortable. And this kind of neoliberal model exists because of the power that our labor holds, because the value in the art market and in the art world is generated by our labor, but it also, the value of anything is generated by the labor of workers. But in the case of artists and cultural producers, our labor also holds additional power, which I'll get into later. But before I get into that, I think it's important to realize that artists, like many workers, can break that cycle through the formation of communities and collective action. And I feel like personally, my first experience with that was the creation of a cooperative that I did with some of my fellow artists at a fellowship that I was participating in, and realizing that by collectively bargaining and pooling our resources, we were able to enhance our working conditions and achieve some of the things that we were told that we were not allowed to do earlier. And so this can, of course, be scaled up to the case of a union for other workers, but basically at its core, it's the idea that people united are stronger and can break these vicious cycles of capitalism that they are being exploited through. And back to the idea of the power that we have as artists and cultural producers, it's not just the fact that our labor creates value like all other workers' labor creates value, but it's also that our production of culture has the potential to mobilize and inspire other workers to form communities, to have collective action, and also to expose capitalism for the fallacy that it is, to expose the fact that to imagine a world beyond capitalism is possible. And that's where we can get into specific tools like folklore and science fiction to be able to imagine a world beyond capitalism and create a revolutionary culture in which we are mobilizing against it and against all of those systems of oppression and dismantling it. And so cultural production that does that kind of mobilization is, in fact, revolutionary cultural production. And it is, in my opinion, the role of artists in society and the role of art in society. I am of the personal conviction that if it is not revolutionary, then in some way or form, if it does not tackle a particular issue in society and in the world, then it doesn't have that much value as a work of art, other than reinforcing a current system that is toxic, right? And a lot of expensive art out there is actually quite bad. And the art market does prioritize and place value on works of art that does allow it to keep on replicating itself and maintaining power for capitalism and those different systems of oppression. And so, again, back to our power as artists and our power as cultural producers, and this is not to sound self-important, but this is to allow the students in the summer academy and different cultural producers to realize that the creating revolutionary culture is one of the driving forces behind all of revolutionary work, and that the revolution wouldn't be possible if it isn't for revolutionary culture. And so this is a lot of time, like capitalism realizes that, and the way that capitalism disarms artists is through mutating revolutionary culture into its own image, is by taking something that is originally revolutionary, by absorbing it, and by spitting it out and mutating it to serve capitalism itself, whether it is, conversations about workers' rights or conversations about women's liberation, about racism. Capitalism, which is the perpetuator of these issues, is then somehow able to rebrand that revolution as something that is part of capitalism and mutate it so that it ends up serving capitalism and creating and actually deepening those systems of oppression. And so this is where the conversation about reappropriation and about being able to use the techniques of capitalism against capitalism itself comes into play. And that's where I end up using, and this is why I personally end up using these different techniques, such as play, such as science fiction, such as folklore, in my work, is in order to be able to absorb some of that capitalist language and capitalist and colonialist techniques, and reappropriate them and mutate them in the form of something revolutionary, as a way to fight back and as a way for artists to take back some of that power. And that brings us to the idea of radical softness. And this is going to sound a little less preachy than what I've talked about earlier, but it still kind of explains where I'm coming from. And radical softness is a term that gained popularity and online queer and femme-presenting people and spaces to describe the act of being radically feminine presenting, or being radically, not having to be hardened, and not having to understand the strength that there is in softness. And I think hard things break and soft things bend, and being soft isn't only a way to survive, but it's also a way to access a lot of power that otherwise wouldn't be possible. It's also what a lot of times inspires us to do the work that we do. A lot of times we realize that we are revolutionaries because of the love that we have for one another. And that love and that tenderness and that softness is why we even bother to fight. We are reminded that people are more important than capital or money. And that this planet that we live on is more that important than capital or money. We fight to undo colonialism because of the love that we have for the indigenous communities and the love that they have for this earth. A lot of the world's biodiversity currently exists on indigenous lands because the indigenous communities are protecting these species from going extinct in the face of multinational corporations that are just so violent, that keep on killing indigenous land defenders in every corner of this earth. And that these brutal systems that are determined to destroy us and to destroy the planet are relentless in their effort. And what keeps us going is the love that we have for one another and the love that we have for this planet. So this is it for now. I hope I didn't take too long, but I'm happy to take any questions. And Yazan, and Khalid, sorry, if you have any interjections, please feel free to start with that now.
Thank you so much, Haitham. Yes, for sure. I have a few questions that I'd love to ask you, and I also want to say that for the those here, you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A box, as well as to, if you'd like, just wait and ask in person in a few moments. I want to ask you, Haitham, first, since revolution is a key term that comes up throughout your talk, what makes a revolutionary image in your view, or what makes a revolutionary artwork? And to ask that more specifically, are you speaking at the level of representation or message, or more at the level of production or circulation, or encompassing both of those? And also, I wonder if you might think about revolutionary art making in conjunction with recent attempts to make revolutionary art, like if we're in the Palestinian context, what it was for the Thawra generation to be producing what they saw of as revolutionary images, artworks, and films, for example. Very much, I think their part of it was about transforming self-representation, right? Taking an image of being a victim and turning it into being a freedom fighter, or from a refugee to a returnee, but also being very much integral to a community that was working together. And, I think that when you spoke about neoliberal art production today, one of the issues is that art is actually, promoted on the basis of its capacity for social change, but often through this kind of single issue way, right? How art will promote women's rights, how art will promote democracy and civil rights, and so on. So just putting a few things out there in terms of ways that, aesthetics and politics are thought recently, to ask you a bit more, how you imagine revolutionary art making.
I think the two issues are related. I think that the revolutionary process of forming communities, collective cooperatives, and unions empowers the artists to create works that would have otherwise been censored by a lot of the neoliberal gatekeepers that sponsor and promote works of art. So as you said, a lot of works are kind of individualized and segmentized and really have a divide and conquer mentality when it comes to allowing specific works of art to exist. However, it really starts at the worker, at the level of the worker, at the conditions in which a worker is allowed and can create work. And of course, the message itself is critical, right? The ability, and it doesn't have to be super didactic. It doesn't have to be as explicit as some of my work is, for example. But it has to be, but in order for it to be revolutionary, it has to be aimed at the dismantling of these different structures of oppression that all can accumulate into capitalism. And so I think that at the end of the day, like you mentioned, the creation of like the reimagining of self and the recent revolutionary art and media making, we are also reminded that, for example, Facebook and Instagram was removing a lot of posts that didn't, that were too revolutionary, right? And that at the end of the day, the same thing that Facebook and Instagram are doing are being done by multiple art organizations and shareholders, because they are being funded by, warlords or oil companies. And so artists individually dealing with those massive systems will always end up being limited in terms of how much they can say and what they can achieve. And so coming together and forming some kind of collective body empowers the artists to be revolutionary. So I think part of it is the process of art making, and part of it is the message of the work itself.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned briefly that that your work is on at Dada right now, but I wonder if you could describe what's on view a little bit, especially what form you're working in, and maybe how some of what you've spoken to relates to users' experience. I say user because your work is often interactive, so if you could speak to that element too.
Sure, and I think part of it is it's inspired by my training as an interactive designer and a game designer. But the work itself is spans different forms of and different media. There's interactive digital work and what I call experimental video games or post-fun games, which are things in which play is present, but it's not there for you to. But having fun isn't the ultimate goal of you playing and interacting with a particular project. There are drawings that exist on paper, on seashells, on pieces of bread, on found objects, a process of kind of covering things and reappropriating it, and kind of queering the way that we view things and queering the way that we are conditioned to view nature and landscape. I think a lot of my work includes some representation of a landscape of some sort, and I think that landscapes are really powerful because landscapes, whether photographs or paintings, have always been used as part of the colonial arsenal to justify invading a place, to justify to justify the abuse that a capitalist colonialist regime would do to a people and a land. Whether it's the Americas and the posters and the paintings and the drawings you see of the Wild West and South America, or whether it's Palestine and these depictions of these pastoral lands inviting Europeans to come and colonize it. There is a history of using landscape images as a tool for colonialism and for capitalism. And a lot of what I do is trying to queer that image and in a revolutionary and reformulate it in a revolutionary way that says that no, landscapes do not belong to the capitalists. Landscapes do not belong to the colonialists. Nature does not belong to any company, any occupying entity. And there is at the core of it an internationalist message and aesthetic.
Yeah, and along those lines, I want to ask you also about some of the symbols maybe that come up in your work. I'm thinking about orbs or asterisks or birds and animals generally. If there's anything you'd like to say about the particular forms that often come up in your work, or also if not those forms in particular, just how you think about maybe the idea of world building also, both as someone who designs, is an interactive designer and artist, and as someone who's thinking about different worlds beyond our present systems.
I think that there's a danger of trying to over-explain a work with every work, right? And I feel part of what makes a work of art effective is not just the ideas that you're trying to communicate, but the affect, emotion, and state of being that you also communicate with a work of art. A good painting, a good novel doesn't just describe text, it describes an emotion, it describes a state of being. And so these are circles and stars are very ancient symbols that have existed since humans started producing images. Hello.
This is not. I won't let her into that too much.
Welcome to the revolutionary cats are a thing, and I'm here for it. But yes, I think that there is. It has to do with the creation of world. It also links to the idea of capitalism trying to own all of history for some reason. Like there is this, capitalism tries to situate itself, and colonialism tries to situate itself as the sole inheritor of all of human history. And those images work to say that no, that isn't necessarily the case. And in terms of digital and interactive media, I think one of the very interesting thing about interactive digital media and video games in particular is that they are a space that you can navigate in a world that one creates and inhabits. And it allows you to separate from what you've been taught to be the norms of this world and be able to explore a new world. It facilitates that process. I'm not saying that you need digital media or video games to do that, but it makes that process easier because you are, your senses are submerged and are aided by that technology. And so that's how I utilize digital media and interactive digital media more specifically into my practice. But it's also aided with those symbols and with that general world building that I create outside onto physical objects as well. And also another part of my practice is the writing. And writing is also, and the text that I use is also another tool within that box of tools that I use.
Thank you. So there are some excellent questions coming in, and I'm going to go to a couple of those. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A box. So Ayab Seso from the Summer Academy asks, can you talk more about what happens when indigenous systems that are built and meant to protect biodiversity are broken, and what's possible in terms of how we reimagine these systems, and maybe also if there's some of your work in particular that relates to this, if you could, speak in terms of your work.
I would say solidarity and internationalism as how we build those systems again. I think it's to understand that we are not in this fight alone, that the entities that are perpetuating this violence against indigenous communities and against the planet are multinational corporations, right, who are doing it in multiple parts of the world simultaneously amongst different communities. And so it is for those communities to come together in an internationalist effort to fight back is how we do it. And the art and culture that we produce should aim around should focus around that. So, and you can see that in all forms of cultural production, whether it's creating these bonds between Palestinian liberation and sovereignty to the indigenous American liberation and sovereignty, and the protesting against the pipelines that are being placed everywhere, to the Black Lives Matter movement and kind of the work towards ending those systemic, violent, murderous organizations that are, and military and police violence. All of these, like there's a lot of cultural production that is happening today that is working around that concept of solidarity and international resistance and organizing.
Thanks. And a question from Vanessa Breeding in the audience. You spoke about using capitalist language and tropes in your work as a way to resist the appropriation or absorption of your work or of generally radical images into capitalism. Can you speak more about how that works in your practice and beyond? And I'll just add a brief detail to that question. Maybe you could speak to some of the images that we saw on screen that I believe were coming from a manual from Solidaire in Beirut. If you could, speak to both how you appropriate capitalist imagery like that, and also how you sort of avoid the reappropriation of your imagery or of radical imagery broadly.
And so, yes, I think starting with my particular practice, this project that's currently on display at Darat al-Funun, and was and the three particular interactive digital works that were published by Lebnاء were originally inspired by a tour that I did of downtown Beirut when I was a fellow student at Ashkal Alwan's home workspace program. Home workspace program. And it was, and part of it was talking about the program was around institutions and structures, and we were doing tours of different parts of Beirut in different neighborhoods of Beirut as part of our induction. And the very first tour was of downtown Beirut, or perhaps the second tour that we did was of downtown Beirut, and I was really horrified to find out that the reconstruction process of downtown Beirut did include, there was more destruction of buildings in the reconstruction process than in the 20 years of civil war. And it felt like a very haunted space. There were probably mass graves underneath these luxury buildings and shops, and the word tabula rasa came up multiple times in the tour, how the war was a tabula rasa, how this was a clean slate. And towards the end of it, we were given that annual report, which was really like a hybrid between like a lifestyle magazine and an annual report with like really beautiful images and design, trying to sell you this scam to an extent. And so what I did was like cover this annual report in its entirety with these like talismanic stars. And out of that report, new images started to appear that then made their way into an interactive digital product that talks about how this is a haunted space, and how the ghosts of this space are reemerging, and seeking some kind of vengeance. And then that kind of conversation about a clean space and haunted spaces was then later taken into thinking about Palestine as a clean slate that has been that is haunted, how Palestinian cities that have been cleansed of their original population have been haunted, how the spirits that we used to communicate with no longer have anyone to communicate with, how our rituals, our practices and our knowledge of the land, of the caves, of the herbs, of the springs, was lost. And so that's how this particular project interacted with the reappropriation of that particular annual report, which was part of capitalist language. In terms of other forms of reappropriation that we see in cultural production, I mean, social media is one example, right? It's a continuous battle because these were not originally platforms that were created for revolutionary work and that are still like very problematic, but it is one of the battlegrounds that we are fighting with. And to be honest, I don't have all of the answers, right? No one does. But I think that there is something, when something is that violent and that oppressive, reappropriating it, approaching it softly and playing with it is an easy way to start bringing it down. Yes.
Thank you. And this is a fairly specific question, but perhaps you can also explain a bit from it for those who have seen the work in Darat. Can you tell us more about the witch mentioned in the wall text? Tala asks.
So this was part of the story that I was told by my mother and my grandmother about my late grandfather, who I've never met, who passed away before I even met him. But this was part of the family lore, that he was on the brink of death. None of the doctors could help them. My great grandmother found this like old lady who came and did some talisman and got a bunch of women to do some offerings somewhere. And the next day he was fine. And it was interesting because that kind of knowledge, that kind of story has been practically erased out of the Palestinian narrative and out of our history. Those a lot of our villages are named after saints who performed miracles that we no longer know much about. A lot of our folklore has been erased because of the threat that it poses to colonialist expansion, or is being misused to pursue a nationalist agenda, when in fact these practices have existed around the world in all societies. And so I was interested in kind of thinking about the revolution as something that tries to recreate that kind of knowledge on an international level.
And a question from Nur Bishuti, who says, thank you for this thoughtful presentation. Haitham, your work engages with the digital and virtual reality worlds. How do you negotiate the imminence of AI and surveillance as unavoidable parts of our digital presence?
I would say that that's another area where reappropriation and play can be very useful, because they allow us to see that they are actually not inevitable. Breaking and playing and just, doing all kinds of things to AI and to virtual reality is a way for us to, first of all, use it for using that technology for purposes other than exploitation, but also to understand that they are not these inevitable, all-present realities that we have to deal with, like capitalism itself. And that's how I negotiate those aspects of my work.
Thanks. And, I'm throwing a lot of questions at you, but we have a number of interesting questions coming in from both Summer Academy participants and the general audience. So from the Summer Academy, again, from Rana Haj Yahya, she asks, in what way does your art provide mobility in the community?
I think that I can't speak on behalf of the community, but I feel like I can speak towards what my intentions are in terms of how I would like to see what my intentions are in terms of art and the community. And I think it has to do with the understanding that forming communities are important. If you are not part of a community, you should look towards being part of one. And the fact that to understand that the capitalism and the different structures of oppression are working towards a conception of ourselves as only individuals rather than parts of community. And what I try to do with my work is try to establish the fact that we have been communities before, we are communities now, and in order to escape this vicious cycles, we have to do it as communities.
To ask you a bit about community, just to add to that something I'm interested in you expanding on a bit, can you speak to what Lebnaء is as you mentioned a multidisciplinary publishing platform, and generally a little bit about your collaboration with other artists, and how both you work with other artists and seek to reach different areas with your art?
And I think that this is something that it's a question that's better posed for Basil Abbas and Ruwan Abdurrahman, who are the people who started Lebnaء Salam with Muqata. I think there is that particular project, Lebnaء, came as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the lack of resources that many artists and cultural producers faced during the pandemic. And so it was the concept of sharing resources and artists supporting one another, both monetarily, physically, materially, and immaterially, through labor, through review, through different forms of support. And that kind of support is at the core of any, and at the heart of any form of revolutionary community building is also at the core of this concept of radical softness, that we care for one another, that our labor isn't just there to be exploited and to exploit other, but rather to care for one another. And in terms of, my collaborations with other artists, I'm currently in conversation with other artists in terms of how we can support one another and how, like the ideal would be to be in some kind of collective or communal entity that has enough power to defend the artists when, for example, a work gets censored, or when a particular organization or institution is not to negotiate for better working conditions, and for not just for the artists themselves, but for workers in general.
Thanks. And this question, which is the last we have up here, though, if anyone else would like to ask a question, we can maybe get one or two more in. From the artist Ali Eyal, asks, is it possible for science fiction to be a piece of ethical quandary? And he says, I mean this in connection with revolution and violence. And specifically, I'm thinking of the revolution in Baghdad and in the cities of Iraq. Isn't it better not to violate the corpse and the revolution, which are two elements that have an excess of imagination and can't bear a science fictional treatment? When do we use the imagination?
I think science fiction and video games have a history of being just horrible, toxic spaces, generally speaking, in mainstream culture, right? Or at least the forms of science fiction that have been encouraged to become popular for the most part have had that. And so I can understand why there is some hesitancy to approach it. And I'm not saying that it is necessary to use science fiction at all, but I feel like in my practice in particular, the reappropriation of science fiction and the reappropriation of video games, which are often capitalist tools, have been useful in making the immensely violent and the immensely unapproachable approachable. In order to take it apart, in order to dismantle it, in order to take an action. But I'm definitely not trying to argue for science fiction as the solution. The revolution is the solution, and the revolution can take many forms, ways and shapes, and there are moments in which science fiction and folklore is appropriate, and there are moments in which they're not. And I'm not here to tell an artist how to produce their work, but that these are tools at one's disposal.
Thank you. Well, we've given you a lot of questions and you've given some wonderful responses, a lot to think through. So I think we're going to wrap up here. And maybe I can ask you to stay for 2 minutes to speak with a couple Summer Academy participants, but we'll end the public elements of the talk here. I want to say, especially as that last question ended on the topic of Iraq and contemporary revolutionary processes there, that the next talk in this series next month will be from the curator and writer Regine Sahakyan, speaking to social and political movements in Iraq and artists' role in them. We have not scheduled the precise date yet, so stay tuned, but that will be next month. Thank you so much, Haitham. This has been really illuminating. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's been a complete pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all of the questions and the opportunity to present my my practice.
Our pleasure. Thank you, and hope that you all get to see Haitham's work in Dada currently.